All right, well, good morning, everybody. This is Rob Presley with the Colorado Resiliency Office, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you today to our webinar on identifying current impacts and future needs. This session is part of the Colorado Resiliency Office's Adaptations and Future webinar series. So just a quick little bit of housekeeping before we get started with today's presentation. If you have any questions for our fantastic group of presenters and panelists today, please do submit them through the questions feature. And the reason you'll need to do this is because all attendees are going to be muted for the entirety of this webinar. Additionally, this webinar is being recorded and will be added to our website at coresiliency.com. You can also find it through the link there on the screen that you see. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, this is part of the Resiliency Office's Adaptations and Future webinar series, where we're covering a number of topics on the COVID-19 pandemic and highlighting action and best practices from communities across Colorado. Today's session is really focused on identifying current impacts and future needs from the pandemic. And we're really seeing that COVID-19 is having wide-ranging impacts on communities, hitting public health, business, employment, housing, education, and a number of other sectors. And it can really be kind of hard to understand the full impacts of this pandemic. So what we're really wanting to do today is have a conversation about how do you take a step back and assess where you are, what are the impacts that you're seeing, what are key variables and data sets that might be good to pay attention to in order to understand those impacts. What tools are available for you to use. And really, sort of looking forward, what maybe should you be paying attention to now to start thinking about how your community might handle a surge or a second wave of cases if and when those come. Next slide, please. And so to guide us through today's conversation, I'm joined by 4 great panelists. We've got Elizabeth Garner, who is the state demographer here in the Department of Local Affairs. She's going to be followed up by Diane Schwenke from the Grand Junction Area Chamber of Commerce. We're also joined by Robin Brown from Grand Junction Economic Partnership and Jody Romero from the City of Grand Junction. And at the end of this, we'll be joined by Kimberly Bullen, who is one of DOLA's regional managers, who is going to be moderating the Q&A session for today. So with that, I will turn things over now to Elizabeth Garner, again, the state demographer here in DOLA, to get us started.
Perfect. Just want to make sure you can hear me.
We can.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you guys very much for having me join your program today. I'm going to be going over a lot of information in terms of what we see in terms of the impacts from COVID on both demographics and economics in the state, at least a little bit, in terms of trying to really understand what are those impacts and the future needs that you might see. So click. So how do we get a handle on all of the data and the information? One of the first things that I recommend doing is really trying to understand and identify and focus on the question that you're trying to answer. You can easily be overwhelmed with all of the data and information out there. And so trying to focus on the question that you're trying to answer is one of the most important pieces to do. And seriously, this can be the hardest part of the entire conversation, is trying to do that piece. The other piece that I really recommend is understand where things were before COVID, and then look at layering COVID on prior, because there are definitely some trends going on before COVID that will impact what's going on in the state now and into the future, and then we can layer COVID on top of that to really get a better understanding of what those future needs may be. Also, it's really important to understand what kind of data is available, how reliable it is, maybe its accuracy, which maybe does and doesn't matter as much, timing of it, and the geography that it's available. Also, understanding that there's a lot of value to local information and surveys, which the women at the end of this or after my session will talk more about what they've been doing locally, and it's huge, that value. And then always remember to ask for help, whether it's within your community, outside of your community, our office, other state agencies. There's a lot of people that are available to help you focus on what some of the information may be that you need. Next slide. So what I like to do is break things down into its buckets in terms of looking at focusing on the question. Do you have a business question? Do you have a question about the population? Do you have a question about different community resources? It could be local governments, it could be public health, schools, whatever it may be. We know that they all overlap, but sometimes being able to segment your questions is a good way to address what variable may be needed. And it's all right if you end up having questions in each area, that being able to separate them sometimes helps you put your eyes, or you really put your mind around what the question is that you're trying to answer. Next slide. So what were things going on prior to COVID that we should be looking at? Big picture, the United States was already slowing down prior to COVID. US increased by 1.5 million people between 2018 and 2019. It's a 0.5 annual average growth rate. This was the slowest growth rate since 1918. And if you've been listening to the news at all the last 4 months, 1918 was brought up a lot regarding the Spanish flu. So that was affecting the world at that time. Likewise, we had the World War I affecting population. And so prior to COVID, we were already as slow as growth when we had these two big impacts of World War I and the Spanish flu. And we will probably see that the growth in the United States from 2010 to 2020 will be as slow as it was in the 1930s. So again, that's important to know going into this. Colorado is at about 5.7 million people, a 1.2% annual average growth rate. You'll see that the other states that were growing faster were in the South and in the West. And that's something really important to remember as we move forward, is that in the United States, we're seeing faster growth in the South and in the West. Colorado increased by 67,000. That was about 7th in the United States. Again, the faster growing states in terms of total numbers were in the South and in the West. Again, important to remember. But this was also Colorado's slowest growth since 2005. And again, 2019 was a pretty stellar year economically as well as incomes. We saw both increasing. But again, slow growth relative to where we've seen things historically. Next slide. And we can see that in this chart. This chart starts in 1970 and goes through 2019. The blue is natural increase, which is burst minus deaths. The red is net migration, the ins minus the outs. And so we can see in 2019 that indeed we are slower, and even slower than we were in the Great Recession in the early 2010s, or 2009 through 2003, 13, 14, we can see that this was slower growth, which I know seems unusual, but it's important to understand we were already on this slower growth trajectory. Next slide. Then it's important to see where was that growth occurring within the state. Every county is very different, and I think it's always important to remember that every county is very unique. If we look at the growth in the state since 2010, the red, orange, yellow counties are counties that have been increasing in population, with the red counties increasing the most. All of the shades of blue are counties that have been declining in population since 2010. So again, important to know what trajectory you were on prior to COVID to understand where you may be going into the future. But about 25% of our counties were already in a phase of decline prior to COVID. Next slide. So why does this even matter? Why am I even talking about population? Well, one, I think obviously population is really important, but at the same point, for you and the work that you're doing, the economy is 70% driven by population. And so it's the consumers that are driving the economy. So it's important to know how many people you've got. Also, obviously, really important to understand their impact on the labor force, and then any type of community service demands that you may be providing, as well, housing, roads and bridges, schools, etc. Also, really important to note that post-COVID, what we should expect is continued population slowing in the United States. This was something that was already going on pre-COVID. We should continue to see that, especially now because international migration has slowed even more than it was pre-COVID. We've seen a slowing in births pre-COVID, even more so post-COVID. Some people think that there's going to be some kind of baby boom, but history and research shows that during pandemics is typically not a time that people decide that they want to bring more children into the world. That stress does not is not conducive for it necessarily. We may see something after COVID to where there's like this pent up demand for kids, but not really until people are secure in terms of their jobs and income will we maybe see more bursts in the United States coming on. Deaths, we've already seen an increase in deaths prior to COVID simply because of our age distribution. And now during COVID, we've seen an increase in deaths. There may be a little bit of a slowdown in deaths post-COVID because we saw an increase during. And so we had kind of deaths that happened before they were really meant to happen. And so we'll see a little bit of slowdown in deaths afterwards. But the big question is migration. And typically migration is job driven in Colorado. So the big question is what's going to be happening with our jobs and will that drive growth to the state? There's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of how our jobs will return in the state, whether we'll be a U, V, W in terms of our return of jobs, or will it be a swoosh? Who knows what that time frame right now will be in the long run? We've got some different models that we're running, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. So because there's a lot of uncertainty, mobility certainly could be slowed down. However, on the other hand, we could actually see an increase in mobility or migration to the state simply because our larger donor states are also experiencing some terrible conditions due to COVID. New York, California, Florida are our largest donor states. We could end up seeing more folks coming from those states to Colorado, and especially because we've seen an increase in use of technology, ability to work from home or remotely, that we may see more people moving to Colorado and bringing their jobs with them wherever those jobs may be. We also may lose fewer people to places like New York, Florida, Washington that are also experiencing traumatic impacts from COVID. Next slide. So then the question is then understanding employment. So or the economy. We've talked a little bit about population. Now understanding the economy is understanding really, again, it's the same pattern. Where were we pre-COVID? And then understanding who you are, understanding your economic drivers, your key industries, and then understanding what that general impact from COVID could be. Because as we'll talk about, there's a lot of lack of data at the county level, especially and below, in terms of employment and income should be lagged about 8 months before we really receive some good data and information. Next slide. So if we look at pre-COVID, where were things going in terms of jobs across the state? As I'd mentioned before, we're doing really well in terms of our economy. We had I think the 4th or 5th best economy in the United States. However, across the state, we can see that all of the red, orange, yellow counties are counties that were above pre-recession peak levels of employment, but all of those blue counties were still counties that were below pre-recession peak levels of employment that were back, pre that first recession or the second recession really in the 2009-10 timeframe. So important to see that what should be our expectations if we are still declining in jobs. Should we have what kind of expectation about employment out into the future? Next slide. So understanding your own economy. What I ended up doing here is I pasted in a couple of pictures from Garfield County. Always important to understand what your base economic drivers are. And so what we see for Garfield County is that their key economic drivers tend to be regional services, which end up being professional services, financial services, construction, really end up driving the largest share of their economy in Garfield County, followed by retirees, and then tourism, government, other income. So these are available at those 2 links that I put there, and I'm going to be sharing a document at the end when you receive information about all of the sessions that give you an idea of what all of these different links are. But this is where you can get this information about your key economic drivers, but what brings in those outside dollars. The second picture is a picture of the total jobs. So it includes also the local resident services, and you can see which ones employ the largest number of people in your community. So again, what we can see here is government, construction, retail, trade are all in those top 3. That government includes all 3 levels of state, fed, and local government jobs in that number 1 piece. So we can see what those are and understand potentially then how COVID could impact your economy. Next slide. So what are we seeing at the state? So since we don't have a lot of great county data yet in terms of those jobs, what we do though is we get data at both the national and the state level. So if we look at the state level, we can look at what were all of the different industries impacted by COVID and by the most, so that we can see what might be that impact in our local area. If we look at the right-hand side of this deck, we can see that 75% of the jobs were lost in those 5 areas of accommodations, food service, health and social assistance, arts, entertainment, recreation, and retail trade, and then other services. Those are the largest ones where we've seen these drops. If we take that information, we can then apply it to the local county level by looking at the next slide. So what we've created in our office is this COVID-19 map series. So each tab is a different map with different information available by county on what's going on within the state. What I'm focusing on right now is that second tab, which is impact by job sector. And what we did, we took those 5 largest job sector areas affected at the state level and applied it locally to each county. Now, this only shows the total number of jobs in those areas, not the total loss, just the total number of jobs. That way we can look at what's the likelihood that we may have an impact in a certain area. I again focused on Garfield County, and then on that left-hand side, you'll be able to see all of the jobs, both total and then looking at proprietors as well as wage and salary jobs in each one of those 5 sectors shown. Those 5 there shown on the slide are at the state level. So then you can compare yourself to what we've got going on at the state. So an important tool, again, to try and understand how could COVID impact your area without actually having a lot of the data available yet. Next slide. So one piece of data that we do get at a county level is that unemployment insurance claims, and that's what this tool is showing. What we've got on the right-hand side is at the state level, how those different pieces are changing. So we've got the total initial claims, so it's aggregated, so it will always be kind of a larger number on the top. And then we've got the second one down there is continued claims and how those are changing over time. And then we've got the third one is a change in continuing claims over time. At the county level, though, then what we can do is we can click on each county and understand how those claims are moving across time. And again, I clicked on Garfield, and we can see those continued claims, initial claims over time. We may be trading this out for continued claims because that might be more relevant into the future. But look at any of those. I'm not going to be able to go through all of those tabs, but I want you to understand what tabs are available by county. Next slide. The last one that I'm going to focus on is this one that's called SVI, Social Vulnerability Index in Colorado. So let's say you're not interested as much in the economic information. Let's say you really want to understand the characteristics of the population and how they may be affected by COVID. These pick up a couple of the different social vulnerabilities that are out there. You may or may not like all of them, but that's why it's nice that you've got a variety that you can look at to understand what may be those vulnerabilities in your own area. There's an aggregate at the far left, that social vulnerability index as a whole, and then you can focus on different pieces, whether it's socioeconomic, households, minority and language, or housing. You can look at those different pieces separately to understand what's going on. And then there's also layers, excuse me, that you can turn on and off that are in that layer button as well. Next slide. And I can't help but also want to try and highlight our demographic profiles that we've got available on our website. These are available, that's the URL for it. You can get it for the municipalities or counties. This gives you a general condition of what's been going on. So if you wanted to know what you were like prior to COVID, this gives you some basic information. And again, these slide decks will be available for you to be aware of what's out there. Next slide. So you may be thinking to yourself, gosh, she is overwhelming me with too much data and information. I get it. I wanted to share with you what's out there, but then also focus on, these are going to be the top 12 that we're really watching in our office. We're going to be creating a new tool on our website that will be going over how these are changing, especially at the state level and national level, because we think that those are important indicators to keep an eye on. You'll see that there's very little information at the county level. And that, again, is why I think these next couple of sessions are going to be really important, because they're going to be really talking a lot about the value of local data and information. Next slide. So just to tie things up, you'll see that there are so many pieces of data and information out there, lots of dashboards, data sets, tools, and it easily can be very overwhelming. What I think is really helpful is to focus on what you want to know and what that question is. Select a couple of indicators to monitor, and then really follow those over time. Don't get too overwhelmed by having too much information. Seriously, make sure you understand where things were pre-COVID, because there are a lot of trends going on that are important to understand. And then we can layer COVID on top of that. Definitely provide us feedback on that map series. If there's other pieces that you like added in or other pieces that you don't like, let us know, because this is a tool in progress that we're working on creating for Colorado. We're also in the process right now of creating our new population and employment forecast by county that we're going to be releasing in October. So if you'd like to be involved in that process or understand where maybe some of the different scenarios are going, definitely contact us as well. So with that, next slide. I would like to turn it back over to the moderators. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. That was fantastic, and just great to see a lot of the available information that is out there for folks. Just want to let people know we did add the link to the COVID-19 map series that Demography has in the chat, and we'll also be including a lot of the information within the slides, and as well as a companion piece that I'll touch upon at the end. So at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Diane Schlinke.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Elizabeth. I was making notes during your presentation as well. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about two specific things. One was you can have all the data in the world, but if you don't have a way to use it and a good communication structure, that can be an issue. So we're going to talk about the Mesa County Economic Development First Responders team that was formed. And then I'll go into the flash polling that our chamber has been doing since late March that gets at least a snapshot of the trends that are happening at the local level. So next slide, please. So Mesa County Economic Development First Responders, we have had a strong economic development partner platform here in Mesa County for a long time. But in response to the pandemic, we actually expanded it. And we are now up to about 15 to 16 members that participate regularly. You can see on the screen, it's a mixture of local government CEOs and nonprofit CEOs that come together, sit down once a week via the Zoom platform, give each other advice, give each other updates, bounce ideas off of each other. It has been incredibly helpful for us to have a unified response in terms of how we help, particularly in the economic development and assisting our small businesses through this crisis. So you can see down there, one of the big things we've done is been a sounding board in terms of effective ways that local governments could assist the struggling businesses in our community. Looking ahead to the possibility of the next stimulus bill at the federal level, we created a 20 for 2020 infrastructure project list that was unified across the county, included both economic development projects as well as public infrastructure projects, so that we can show this to our congressional delegation, and we've got some shovel-ready projects that they know can be funded. And then the other thing is some of our shared advocacy efforts. We've invited, for instance, the congressional delegation to sit in on a couple of our meetings, keeping us up to date, providing for that two-way communication. So that has been huge. And I do have in your resources a list of everyone who serves on our Economic Development First Responders team. Next slide, please. So in our organization, one of the things we realized very quickly was that things were moving very quickly. Our business community had a very short notice when we were issued the stay-at-home order. And so the Grand Junction Area Chamber began a series of polling. And I'm using that word strategically. If you look at the links to the various polls, they started out as surveys. But polling seemed to resonate more in terms of a quick turnaround for our businesses, and it actually increased our participation level. So we have about 1,400 emails of members or representatives of our members from across Mesa County. Even though we're the Grand Junction Area Chamber, our membership doesn't stop at the city boundaries. So we did a series of 4 polls through SurveyMonkey. The last one was done about a month ago. We're getting ready to launch another one. The whole idea was to get a snapshot of what was happening on the ground very quickly. So a couple of things stayed the same. One was these were very short. And in SurveyMonkey, if you've used that tool before, it'll actually calculate for you how long it would take a respondent to answer the questions. Most of them were 2 to 3 minutes. And we put that in there, so it's only going to take you 3 minutes. The other things was we had pretty good stability in terms of who was answering the surveys over time. So most of them were very small employers, 10 employees or less. We saw great diversity in terms of the industries represented, from hospitality to construction and everything in between. And then I had one question that was standard throughout the entire survey process, which I'll get to in a minute and in the next slide or two. What did change, however, is most of our questions were adjusted to reflect what was going on over time. So when PPP came on the scene, we asked questions around that. When we were looking at the whole layoff and furlough situation. And then as Mesa County moved into its 2 variance processes, you know, what was the ability, the capacity, and the impact on our local businesses as we gradually started to reopen. So the other thing we always kept asking was, what kind of assistance were the small businesses looking for? And that also has changed over time. The number one thing was for them to be able to preserve cash, because they had no cash coming in the door, which the delaying of tax payments was a huge help to them. And then also PPP, the state funding sources, we have a lot of funding mechanisms now for our small businesses. But now what they're really looking for is more in terms of, what am I going to be required to do with reopening? We just did a webinar yesterday on what's my legal liabilities, and how do I plan for the future in an environment that, you know, we're in quicksand every day within our business community. So next slide, please. So this is, I have these next 2 slides show you the one constant question that I asked on all of the surveys, which was, to what extent has COVID-19 affected your business income? And you can see the first one was very early. It was, I believe it was completed about March 28th, right after the shutdown. And so you can see that if you look at it, the over 50%, we were around 22, 23%. And then the next one, we move into April, you can see that number really moves. Now we're up 10 percentage points. We're up to 35, 37% are affected, over 50% with regard to their business income. Next slide, please. So then we get into the May and June timeframe, and you can see in May, as we gradually started some of the reopening, it fell back a little bit. But by the time we got to June, because of our reopening, you can see that the impact, those affected over 50%, had dropped below 20%. So that was a real indicator to us in terms of the value of the reopening process and how it was affecting our businesses and their income levels. So next slide, please. So one of the things that our county health department wanted to know is, you know, how are things going? And then we wanted to know, as we get back into gradually reopening the slow process, you know, how are you doing? So this flash poll number 4 was completed on June 12th. And you can see that for Mesa County, at least, and the respondents to the survey, we had almost 45 to 46% that were operating over 75% of normal. That's a really good sign and something that we took great encouragement from. And so you also saw, however, that we still had in the 10 to 20% level that were still being at less than a quarter of their normal business operations. So again, it gives you a good quick snapshot. Next slide, please. So we also talked about what the long-term impacts might have been with regard to layoffs or furloughing of employees. So again, this was when Mesa County's second variance was in existence, so we were more open than the rest of the state. But I asked the question in terms of what's going on with employees, you know, and one of the things that I found kind of distressing was that we had over 25%, closer to 28, 29%, that said they were not intending to call back employees. That's a bit of a red flag. But then if you want to look at the glass half full analogy, we were basically at 50 to 100% for 50% of the people who answered this survey. So we were putting people back to work, and that was the good news in the survey. Again, you know, all of these things are this isn't statistically significant. This is just to give you a sense of what was going on the ground. Next slide, please. So the other question that we asked is, okay, how confident are you feeling about the future? Where are we looking at in terms of business investment? What do you think is going to happen with the economy? And the good news here is that we're not too bad. You know, we had again over 42% that said, hey, we're going to be much better than where we are today, the first part of June, but we're still not going to get to where we would have been if you'd have asked me this question in January. And then and another significant 40% said it's going to be better. We're looking, it's slightly better, but it's still going to be better. So next slide, please. So here are some key takeaways and how this particular data set has led to some action. And one of the things I didn't mention earlier is in terms of the percentage, this went out to about 1,350 emails. So we had between 12 and 15% response rate, which we thought was pretty good overall. And so there were some open-ended questions that you'll see if you go to our links on the results. And one of them was, one of our small business owners was the one who suggested that maybe local governments follow the state lead with regard to giving businesses more time to make their payments. And that was something the city of Grand Junction had been contemplating. It was good to have verification that that would help, and it led to some action. And then one of the other major things that, just like all of us, that small businesses said from the very beginning is, we are just so overwhelmed. There is so much information out there. We can't keep up. We're worried, we're frantic, and so our ED partners, as well as our chamber, kind of sorted and prioritized some of those resources for them so that they didn't have, you know, thousands of emails or websites to go to. Here's the most significant things you need to know right now. And in terms of our feedback, that was one of the major things that they truly appreciated from us very early on. Along with, we launched a series of now 17 webinars lasting 30 to 45 minutes for our businesses, giving them the key information they need right now. Preserving cash and grant funding drove decision-making in terms of what our local governments acted on in terms of helping us economically. So that was, again, something that came out of this data set. And what we're seeing right now is the need for cash right now today tends to be decreasing, which is very different than where it was 6-8 weeks ago. But we're also seeing the potential that as PPP loans are exhausted, we may see more of that. So that's some of what we're looking ahead to ask questions about in our next polling. Next slide, please. So in terms of the other questions, and I was on a lot of webinars in terms of the PPP distribution, our survey and polling data showed that in Mesa County, we did considerably better than other counties. We think there's a couple of reasons for that. One was that we got the information out to our businesses very early on. Those webinars were open to any business anywhere in the county, and you didn't have to be a chamber member. You didn't have to live within the city limits of Grand Junction. And we did a webinar like 3 days before the PPP went live, saying, here's the information you need to gather today so that you and your banker can get in quickly. We think that helped, and we think also the regional banks had helped as well. The reopening strategies, the support for the Mesa County Health Department's variance request, our polling data that showed that businesses were able to comply and that they wanted to reopen in the first place was used as part of our health department's variance request to support their ask at the time. And we're continuing throughout all of this to share what is on the ground for our small businesses, that it's what's happening on the ground now, that it goes beyond anecdotal information, that is really the key to these kinds of polling, and being able to really speak in like real numbers in terms of here's what a broad brush looks like right now today. And it's not real difficult to do, and we're going to continue to do it into the future. So I think that is my last slide. So I'll turn it over to the moderator.
Great. Thank you, Diane. Up next, we have Robin Brown from the Grand Junction Economic Partnership.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks, Diane. That was awesome. And I think probably one of the most important things we did as a community was that economic development first responders group, which grew with each week as we added partners to it. So that was the way we could be really reactive and solve problems quickly. Next slide, please. So I just have one slide, and really it's kind of a snapshot. And I think it's important, you know, when we talk about the incredible growth that happened in Colorado over the last 10 years, that was very limited across the state. So that growth happened in about 9 to 10 Front Range counties. When you look at the other 55 counties, we stayed in that recession significantly longer, almost a decade. But in our community, at least in Mesa County, we got to work about 5 years ago, really trying to pull ourselves out of it and diversify the economy. And so we, pre-COVID in February, we're coming off of 3 to 4 years of positive economic growth, still climbing out of that 2008 recession and not yet hitting pre-recession numbers. But we were strong coming into 2020. 2020, I think, started out stronger than anticipated, and we're finding that a lot of increased sales tax revenue and other numbers that go along with that were in January and February were stronger than budgeted, and so that I think in the long run is going to help offset the losses of March, April, and May. But we did have we were coming from a place of growth. I think that's what was even more devastating for a community like ours going into COVID and the shutdown, was that we had worked so hard to climb out of it, and then the big question was, how far back did we just step? You know, it's the 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So how many, what was this damage going to be, and how long? The primary question we at the Grand Junction Economic Partnership wanted to answer was, how long will it take to get back to essentially February numbers, pre-COVID numbers, so we can continue the growth that we had worked so hard over the last, 4 to 5 years on. And so we partnered with CMU to work on a really large scale survey that on its own would have, if we had hired someone, cost us about $40,000, but we dedicated our entire staff. CMU put a bunch of interns on it in order to have a really large scale diversified industry survey. And the whole point of that was to figure out, and it was for CMU to put together an economic forecast. And so what the point of that was to tell our municipalities, to tell the cities of Fruita, Palisade, Grand Junction, and Mesa County, at what point, what's the planned loss, and when can we plan to be back to pre-COVID numbers? And it's still a guess, but it's a pretty educated guess. And so again, I think right now, and Jody Romero, who will be speaking next, can speak to the fact that right now it's a wild guess on what the losses will be this year. And so we're hoping to give them a more informed number to plan to. Another thing though is that a couple things. The recession and 11% unemployment is not that far behind us. And I think that actually has proved to be a strength for Mesa County, because very quickly, again, we were able to react, and we by no means wanted to revisit 11% unemployment. And I think that we're already seeing the results, positive results from all that effort. We did hit 12%, I think, in April, but very quickly it shot down to 9% in May, which is lower than the state average, which might be a first for Mesa County. But also significantly lower than the national average. Also, this recession, we've had a boom and bust cycle over here for decades. And so this recession is very different than past recessions in that previous recessions were really high wage energy jobs. This is definitely very different because it's tourism related. So it's more seasonal and minimum wage jobs. So it feels very different than past recessions. And we had entire sectors of our economy that were unaffected. So a lot of manufacturing did not slow down at all. Construction remains strong. And so it feels very different. And we're hoping that means our recovery will be quicker. Looking forward, it really has changed how we recruit new business and new industry into the Valley. We used to focus specifically on industries, and now we're focusing much more on owner-operated companies, of small companies that care about quality of life and safety. So we've always sold ourselves as a disaster-free zone. We don't have floods or fires or anything. We don't have hurricanes or earthquakes. And it was funny because when COVID hit, I kind of thought, oh man, we're not disaster-free anymore. However, if you're aware, we had really low COVID numbers. Our quality of life remains fairly normal because we're 75% public land, so it's really easy to get outside and recreate. And so our quarantine was much less restrictive and probably emotionally draining than more urban, densely populated areas. So our isolation has proved to be a strength. And in the middle of all of this, we actually had a prospect that we've been working with for over a year. And they made their decision 2 weeks ago to move their company to Grand Junction because of the quality of life here, even during the quarantine and based on safety and all of those factors that went in, Grand Junction looked like a pretty good place compared to a larger city that they were considering. So we're again, as we look forward to marketing and recruitment, it's definitely more based on quality of life, which we did before, but it was definitely more industry focused. But now it's small owner operated companies who really care about their employees and the quality of life that their employees have. One thing I did want to say is I think we're going to see across the state, we're definitely going to see an increase in population, in my opinion. And that, but I think also places like Mesa County and more rural places are going to see people and businesses move out of Denver and into the more rural areas if they're able to. We get these state RFPs from the Office of Economic Development, and those are companies looking for certain types of real estate, certain types of incentives. And so they'll send these out, and normally we get them about one a month. And if any of you out there are economic developers, you know that we're now getting them at least once or twice a week now, and that has really been a change that came, I think, is COVID related, as companies look to move out of places like California and New York into places, more rural places. And then also just anecdotally, talking to real estate agents here, we're just seeing so many people move in from, again, high density areas. And it used to be, last year I think that was primarily Denver, but we're seeing a lot more people from California and New York and the East Coast as well. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. I just want to encourage folks or remind folks too that are here in the audience to continue to send in questions for the presenters through the question box. We will get through as much as we can after our next presenter, Jody.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, and thanks to Diane, Elizabeth, and Robin. I wanted to go last because I knew they would have such wonderful information to share, and they did so. So for the City of Grand Junction, I know we're running a little short on time. I'm going to go ahead and just highlight some of the things that I wanted to bring up. But I really termed this reaction, relief, and recovery. Next slide, please. So this is a timeline. I won't go through all of this. But I think what everyone else has experienced, and I think Diane mentioned it, everything was moving extremely quickly, but I am proud of the City of Grand Junction and the leadership that both our city manager, Greg Caton, and our council showed in terms of responding and reacting very quickly, and as well as in cooperation with our economic development partners, which we, both Diane and Robin referred to. One of the other things I wanted to add to this slide or to this timeline is we also did several things for our employees in preparation for the impact of COVID or in reaction to the impact. And one of those things was creating a daycare. So March 23rd was a big day for us in a couple different ways. And we also created a daycare, as I was referring to, for our employees who were losing daycare services in the community. Next slide, please. So as Diane referred to, and Robin as well, we work with our economic development partners very closely. And one of the results of that partnership was, as Diane referred, helping businesses with cash flow. What were we going to do and what could the city do in a very quick way to help the businesses that were suffering cash flow losses? So we did a sales tax deferment program, which basically meant you did not have to pay your sales tax that was going to be due to the city in March, which was for February activity. So that was the last good month before the closures occurred until July 31st, 2020. So we had 59 businesses participate in that. $245,000 worth of taxes were deferred. And I think more importantly, over 890 employees were in those businesses that chose to participate in this. 32 of those businesses have already repaid. Something else I think is important, even though there were only 59 businesses, we had over 400 businesses that don't normally not file sales taxes, not file. So for those folks, we did reach out to them and are working with them to get them back into compliance and waiving late penalty and interest and doing payment plans with those folks as well, with those businesses. The GJ Strong Fund is something that we worked with a local foundation to distribute $500,000 to agencies in order to provide immediate assistance for basic needs of food and shelter. GJ Strong Appetite was another employee program where the city encouraged employees to spend at local restaurants, and up to 50% of their spending there was reimbursed by the city. $82,000 was spent in the restaurants over I think it was probably a 2-week period. And then we also most recently are working with our incubator center here in Grand Junction in order to distribute $540,000 worth of business loans and grants. So the PPP came into play for payroll costs, but there were other costs and expenses of businesses that because of the cash flow issue, they weren't able to pay, including mortgage and rent and insurance. So these business loans and really loans / grants, because they are, as long as they submit a plan and receipts for spending of that money, they're forgiven. So that's really a form of a grant as well. Next slide, please. Okay, in terms of recovery, a lot of our recreation programs, as you can imagine, because of facility closures and social distancing requirements, were not able to get off the ground this spring and summer. But recently, our summer camps were open with COVID restrictions in place, but they've been very popular and filled up right away. We also have had several facility reopenings. Our parks were busy from the get-go because those were some activities that people could still participate in while also doing the exercising the social distancing. But those have become even more busy, I think, in the latter months because Mesa County, I think we're up about 136 cases right now of COVID. So we've been very low comparatively in the state from the beginning. So we have folks visiting from outside of our area into our parks as well. We also opened a new river park at the Las Colonias Business Park. Our council also has been very flexible with restaurants and requirements, allowing some more flexibility in outdoor eating spaces, and in fact are considering next week another form of flexibility in terms of allowing for public consumption and communal dining in the downtown area. So since the restaurants have limitation on space and capacity, our council, in cooperation with the Downtown Development Authority, are trying to figure out how we can allow restaurants to serve more customers. In terms of capital projects, we saw major capital projects going on. A riverfront at Dos Rios, which is a huge development, just getting off the ground. We just received an $8.5 million bid for the infrastructure in that area and are working with a private developer for the sale of that entire area for the vertical construction. We are getting ready to finish a new fire station at the end of this year. A Las Colonias Business Park with GJEP has been very involved in, completed this year, and the River Park was what opened in that area. Also, we had a very important trail that loops from our riverfront trail, another 1.5 mile extension into some outdoor activity areas. In terms of financial impact and outlook, I think I'm probably going to wait and see if there are any questions in that area. I want to limit my time, but I do think I want to say, as all the other speakers have said, it's really going to be when we're going to understand the impact is really when we understand what happens to permanent job loss and what industries that job loss occurs in. In terms of sales tax revenues, which is city, that's our major source of revenue. In March, the March retail activity was 12% down. April retail activity was 25.3% down, which we think is the bottom, we hope is the bottom. And so far, these are preliminary numbers, we're finalizing these, but for the May retail activity, we believe is about 9% down. So I think we're unique in our area, and I think there's also federal funds that are still circulating in our economy, and that's not unique. So I think what we need to watch for is when those funds are out of the economy and what it looks like in terms of permanent job loss. I'll stop now and open it back up for questions.
Great, thank you. That was a lot of great information from all of our presenters. We have a few minutes here before our top of the hour deadline. So Kimberly, if we can go ahead and get started, let's see how many questions we can get through.
Yeah, great, Rob, thanks. And thanks to our presenters. That was some really great information. First question came from Barb Smith, wondering, and I think this is for Elizabeth Garner, wondering if the baby boom from people staying at home time will balance out the growth death rate and be growth in Colorado.
Hi, yeah, so no, we actually don't think so. We had seen a slowdown in births to begin with, and we don't think that there's going to be a boom from people staying at home simply because there's so much uncertainty. There's about 7,000 fewer births in the state now than there were, and this is pre-COVID, prior to then when we at our peak in 2007. So we do not see growth coming from births.
Great, thank you. I think this is also another question for Elizabeth, but I would also open it up to our other presenters who might have some additional points they'd like to make. This comes from Laura Levy. They are building their pre, during, and post-COVID data in Larimer County for their recovery plan. They're using data collection surveys, but what other data is available to them, both state data and broken into regions? And I think some of the information that Elizabeth, you presented might be a good resource, but I'll turn that over to everybody that wants to comment.
Yeah, I would just first say, just reach out, give me a holler or anybody on our team, and we can help identify what's available versus not available. And just remember, every county actually has access to the wage and salary file that gives a listing of all firms. As long as you don't publicly release it, this is available from the Department of Labor. So you can have a pretty good idea of all of the firms in your county or community and what industry they're in.
Great. Would any of the other presenters like to comment?
Well, this is Diane, and I'll just chime in and I'll tell you, I think there is great value in accessing the business community and doing quick polling of them, because they know what's happening today, and the data is always going to lag a little bit behind. So I just think there's real value in talking to the job creators and maintainers as well.
Great. Another question from Laura is she'd love to see the survey and poll questions that people are using. So Rob, I don't know if there's a chance that we could collect that information and post it somewhere, maybe on the CRO's website.
Yeah, that is something that's going to be part of a companion piece that we'll be sending out to attendees. Diane, you were going to be sharing the poll and questions that you had sent out, correct?
Right, that is on the resource page that I sent to DOLA yesterday. There's a link to all 4 polls, so you can see the complete polling data and the questions that were asked.
Great. Another question from George Marlin for Elizabeth. Is SBI calculated using average or median values?
Each value is in there specifically, and it will tell you, I think you said SVI as in Sam Victor I don't know what that is. They're put in there and it will say specifically if it's like there's a per capita value in there, so that's obviously not either. So if you need assistance looking at any of those pieces, let me know. And that comes directly from the CDC's website. So there's a button that you can click on that website that will take you exactly there and to each variable and explain each variable and its value.
Great, and I think Marguerite has posted Elizabeth's contact information in the question section here, but we can also get you that if you need additional information. Maybe one last question for the sake of time. This is from Laura. Are you tracking information as it relates to equity and vulnerability communities? And probably Elizabeth, that's a question for you as well.
So that's a really good question, and one that's been coming up a lot recently, not only in terms of impact, but then also on recovery. And we're doing as much as we can in terms of that recovery if those questions are asked. A lot of times on that recovery piece, the questions aren't asked in terms of like race and ethnicity, certainly, or income status, for example, but there's a piece, and it's going to be part of my companion piece that they have. The Census Bureau is doing it's called the Household Pulse Survey, and they also have a Business Pulse Survey. It's statewide and nationally, it doesn't go down to local areas, but they do have information broken down by race and ethnicity and gender and income. So there is a pretty good way to get an idea of, for example, impact on that side, but then I think it's a really good question to ask on whether it's the grant making side or the loans or any of it is anybody tracking that by, for example, race and ethnicity or income or other qualifications. And I think that's something that as a state, we should be looking at being able to try and gather.
Great, thank you. I think for the sake of time, I think we've gone through all the questions that have been submitted. So I'll turn this back over to Rob and let him close it out.
Great, thanks, Kimberly. And actually that last question kind of ties nicely into the next session that we're having as part of this series, which will be focused on inclusive and equitable public health engagement. So we'll be doing a lot more deeper dive into those issues around equity. So I encourage everybody to join us from 2 weeks from now for that session. I just want to thank again Kimberly for tackling the Q&A session, and thanks to all of our panelists today for a really insightful and interesting conversation. Just as a reminder, we will be sharing out the slides from today's webinar, as well as the companion piece, which I've mentioned a few times already. That's going to include a lot of the links and information about a number of the resources that our presenters have shared here. It's also going to include some information about how Larimer County has been undertaking an unmet needs assessment, which is focusing on economic and workforce, community support services, and government education and infrastructure through collecting past survey data and conducting focus group surveys and conversations. So a little bit more information on that. So thanks again for everybody joining today, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day.